Hello, my little historians, and welcome to Lesson 837A on the 7 Principles of Government. So, as always, the name of the lesson will always be across the top of the page, it will always be in bold, and it will always be in caps. It will also always include a number system. So, in this case, it is 8 because we are in 8th grade. Unit 3, which has to do with the Constitution. Lesson 7, that's the lesson that comes after Lesson 6, but before Lesson 8. And we actually break this down into 7A because we are taking lesson 7 and we are breaking it up into more than one different lesson. So today's lesson is just going to be an overview on the 7 principles of government. So before we get started, let's go ahead and get started with our bell ringer. As always, the name of the page will always be at the top. It will always be underlined. It will always be in italics, that kind of slanty text. And the reason for that is so that when we are going through this, you will always be able to find what page you are supposed to be on. So moving on. The blank feared a strong central government and refused to ratify the Constitution without a blank. The Declaration of Independence contained several blank against the king. The Virginia House of Burgesses was the first example of blank in North America. The battle cry of the American Revolution was no blank without blank. And in 1215, the blank limited the power of the king. So as always, this will make your life so much easier, I promise. I know that it feels like more work. You're supposed to find the key concept and then go looking and then go find the answer instead of just giving the answer. But the fact is, if you identify your key concepts, it will make your life easier. So, what is the key concept here? Strong central government, that's one of them. Ratify the Constitution. Once again, Constitution, yes, that is a key concept. That is something that we talk about all the time, except this entire unit, Unit 3, is all about the Constitution. So, ratify the Constitution is really your key concept there. And that also was the name of the lesson for the 836. So, if we're talking about a strong central government, the vocab word that we learned in the previous lesson was federal. So if we're talking about a group that feared a strong central government, then that's not going to be a federalist because federalists wanted a strong central government. So we're talking about somebody who is afraid of a strong central government. That would be the anti-federalists right over here. They refused to ratify the Constitution without a Bill of Rights. That's the two big things you need to remember about the anti-federalists. They were afraid of a strong central government and they wanted a Bill of Rights. The Declaration of Independence contains several blank against the king. So first of all, key concept there is going to be the Declaration of Independence. There are several things we got to know about the Declaration of Independence, but it says contained several. That means a list of something, against the king. So if you remember, the Declaration of Independence declared independence. Why did we want independence? So in this case, the correct answer is going to be grievances. Once again, those are official complaints. The Declaration of Independence contains several official complaints against the king. And that's a very important thing that we need to remember, not just for this, but also moving forward when we start talking about the Bill of Rights. The Virginia House of Burgesses was the first example of blank in North America. It was representative, but it was not representation. It was the first example of self-government in North America. And once again, this is a very important idea. It ties in with the anti-federalists who wanted more power for the states and were worried about the national government, the central government, the federal government being too strong. So we're going to talk about that some more when we talk about our 7 principles. But the answer there is self-government. The battle cry of the American Revolution was no blank without blank. Once again, battle cry of the American Revolution, that's your key concept. You look that up, you're going to find no taxation without representation. Once again, we're going to be talking about that a lot when we get into our principles of government. And then lastly, in 1215, the blank limited the power of the king. So this takes us back to lesson 835, which talks about the influences on the Constitution. So in 1215, that would be the Magna Carta. limited the power of the king, which once again, we'll be talking about as we continue with the lesson. So, moving forward. So, today's objective. The student will be able to analyze how the U.S. Constitution reflects the principles of the 7 principles of government. Now, if you try to just remember these, it's going to be rough. So, I want you guys to remember the acronym FLIPRCS. FLIPRCS. And I know that a lot of you guys are saying, wait a second, where's the other I? There is no other I. But if I try to put it together in a different way, you're not going to remember it. So, FLIPRCS. FLIPRCS. F is for federalism. Once again, federal means a strong national government. We're going to talk about that some more when we get to that page. L refers to limited government. I refers to individual rights. We'll go into these definitions some more when we get to the actual page. P refers to popular sovereignty. R refers to republicanism. This does not mean the Republican Party. Republicanism means something different. Checks and balances. Once again, we're going to get to that more in depth, not just in this lesson, but also in the next lesson. S, separation of powers, which again, we're going to talk about this when we get to the next lesson. The main thing you need to understand is that all of these are talking about power, and they are talking about the government. We'll go into how in our next couple of pages. So, we're going to start off with the idea of principles. What is a principle? A principle is a law or a fact of nature that explains how something works or why something happens. The definition I prefer to use is a guiding rule. So what sort of principles do doctors or firefighters or teachers have? Do we get to play favorites? Do doctors get to say, well, this person is female, so I'm not going to treat her. Well, that person is a Democrat, so I'm not going to treat him. Well, that person is short, that person is fat, that person is ugly, that person is... No. Doctors treat everyone. Doctors have to try and heal everyone. Firefighters, same thing. They don't get to choose who they rescue. They rescue everyone. Teachers, we don't choose who we teach. We teach everyone. And if somebody doesn't fully understand, we need to go the extra mile. The bottom line is, we have guiding rules that tell us how we got to do something. So, we begin with republicanism. So, republicanism, as I said, does not mean the Republican Party. The Republican Party, I want you to remember, republicanism, rep. So, republicanism means the people elect representatives to govern for them. So, the issue is that if the people were going to vote on every law every time, it would take forever. We pass 10,000 laws a year. Of those laws, there are dozens of extra laws that are inside them. Ain't nobody got time for that. So, what happens is the people choose representatives. So when you think about republicanism, think about think about representative government. Moving on, popular sovereignty. If you don't know what a word means, stop. Break it down. Popular means people. And sovereignty means power. So popular sovereignty means the people have the power and they use it by voting. If people don't like the way that their government is acting, the people are the ones in charge. So everybody who thinks that the president is in charge of the government, no. The president has to stand for re-election. Therefore, the people are in charge of the government. Federalism. As I said, the definition for federalism is federal is a strong national government. So federalists want a strong national government. Federalism refers to a strong national government that shares power with the states. So that means that in some cases they have two totally different powers. So for instance, when it comes to law enforcement, the federal government has the FBI. The F in FBI is Federal Bureau of Investigation. Federal agents for a strong national government. Whereas in the state of Texas, we have the Texas Rangers. Texas Rangers are the law enforcement agency for the state of Texas. However, they also share powers. For example, taxes. The government will collect taxes on certain items. The state of Texas collects taxes on certain other items. But the bottom line is, in both cases, they collect taxes. And this is the most important thing to say about federalism. A lot of students confuse federalism with separation of powers. Remember, in some cases, these are separate. So, for instance, the state of Texas will conduct elections, whereas the national government will be in charge of whether or not we go to war. However, they also share powers. So that's the word I want you to remember when it comes to federalism. Shares. Because a lot of these powers overlap. We're going to talk about that some more when we get to separation of powers. Moving on. Separation of powers. The power of government, like I said, every single one of these talks about power and government. So the power of the national government is separated into 3 branches. So first of all, one more time, separated. That means totally distinct. There is no overlap. That's what I want you to remember when we talk about federalism. Federalism, there is overlap, like collecting taxes or enforcing the law. Whereas separation of powers, no overlap. These are totally separate. So the power of the national government is separated into 3 branches, and those 3 branches are the legislative branch, that's going to be Congress, and Congress makes the laws, writes the laws. The executive branch will enforce the laws. So, as an example, we talked about the FBI, which is law enforcement. The FBI answers to the Attorney General, answers to the President. So, the executive branch enforces the laws. They're in charge of carrying out or executing the laws, hence the word executive. The judicial branch, this is going to be the Supreme Court. They're in charge of interpreting the laws or judging the laws. So just remember, you drop the show, you've got Judy. Who's the most famous Judy we know? Judge Judy. So the judicial branch is in charge of interpreting the laws. We'll talk about that some more when we get to lesson 837B. Moving on, limited government. Once again, everything talks about power. So the power of the government is limited. There are limits to the power of the government. It cannot do whatever it wants. There are restrictions. We're going to talk about this some more when we get to lesson 838, talking about the Bill of Rights, because limited government is all about restricting the power of the government, limiting the power of the government. Individual rights. Once again, individual means personal, rights, freedoms. So there are personal freedoms, personal rights, personal freedoms protected by the Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. So personal freedoms. We're going to talk about that some more when we get to lesson 838 again. And then lastly, we have checks and balances. Once again, everything talks about power and the national government. Checks and balances is the sibling to separation of powers. So just as we take all of the powers of the national government and we split them up, now all of these powers can check the power of the other branches. Just like when a teacher or a parent says, check yourself, they're saying stop. So all of these branches can stop the power of the other branches. And when they do that, power is balanced. So we're going to talk about this some more, once again, in lesson 837B. But once again, Congress has powers to check the judicial branch and has powers to check the executive branch. The executive branch, the president, has powers to check the legislative branch and to check the judicial branch. The judicial branch has powers to check the legislative branch as well as the executive branch. So all of these are kind of like a 3-legged stool, which once again, we'll talk about some more in lesson 837B. So let's go ahead and move on to our assignment. So right here, we have a picture of a voting box. And I don't really like this one because it's a little bit confusing. There is a little bit of overlap there. But when people vote, who are they voting for? They are voting for their representatives. So republicanism. So republicanism. What is republicanism again? One more time. That is, people elect representatives to work in government for them. So one more time. The people are in charge because they are choosing their representatives. How does this work? Representative government. One more time. Republicanism, representative government. That's what you got to keep in mind. Next, we have Popular sovereignty, because once again, we've got a picture of all of these people, and the people are in charge. How are the people in charge? People have the power to run the government. They use it by voting. So one more time, the example of this is voting. The people choose their representatives, and if they don't like that representative, when the next election rolls around, they can choose a different representative. So that's how that works. One more time, how are government powers distributed? This is going to be federalism. Federalism, which once again, federal means a strong national government. However, the main word you need to remember with this is a strong national government, federal, shares powers with the states. One more time, they have a lot of the same jobs, they have some different jobs, but the bottom line is, when you think about federalism, think about shared power between the states, because we're going to come back to this when we talk about separation of powers. What is the best example? Like I said, when it comes to law enforcement, the national government, the federal government has the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They're in charge of law enforcement. And then the state government, the state of Texas, for instance, has the Texas Rangers. That is Texas law enforcement. And that's what I want you guys to remember when we think about federalism. Sometimes they are the same, sometimes they are different, but they share powers. That's the main word you need to remember with federalism: shares. Next, up here we have what looks like some sort of tree, and it's got parts of government on it. Once again, this is going to be separation of powers. You will notice these don't overlap. They are all part of the same tree, but they don't share powers. These powers are distinct and separated. So, power of the government is separated into 3 branches. That's the main thing you need to remember about separation of powers. 3 branches. 3 words, 3 branches. So, what are these branches? That would be the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. One more time: legislative, executive, judicial. I don't know if you guys can see that, but that's what it says right there. Next, we have a picture of Congress, except that it's tied up in police tape, except that doesn't say caution, do not cross. That says limits. So it sounds like Congress is tied up with limits. That would be limited government. One more time, this means the power of the national government is limited. How is it limited? Well, separation of powers is part of that. Federalism is part of that. The Bill of Rights is part of that. We're going to talk about that one in a little bit. Best example, like I said, no one is above the law. Everybody has to obey the law, including members of the government. Next up, we have this picture of the United States, but across it, it says free speech zone. Freedom of speech, what would that be? That would be individual rights. One more time, each individual, each person gets their own set of rights and set of freedoms. It's not like, okay, well, white people get these freedoms, or Catholics get those freedoms, or tall people get these other freedoms. No, everybody gets them. It's weird that it's everyone, therefore it's individual. But the bottom line is, every individual has these rights. So one more time, the government must protect rights for each individual. What is the best example of that? That would be life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. These are the unalienable rights we talked about with the Declaration of Independence. Now, one more time, what exactly does liberty mean? Well, we're going to talk about that some more when we get to lesson 838 on the Bill of Rights. Next up, as you can see here, we have the same pictures that we have up here for the separation of powers. We've got Congress, the Supreme Court, and the president, the White House, the president's house. So, in the middle of that, we have a picture of a check and a picture of a scale. So one more time, that is checks and balances. So that means each branch of the national government checks the power of the others. And if they check each other's power, then that means that power is balanced. So the best example of this, that would be words like veto, impeach, and unconstitutional. I know that a lot of these words are really, really confusing. You don't know what they mean right off the bat. That's okay. We're going to talk about those when we get to the next lesson. So those are your 7 principles of government. Let's take a look at your exit ticket. You're going to be doing the second one on your own, but we're going to work on this first one together. It says the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. What exactly does that mean? Well, let's look for our shared terms. The words that you need to remember for separation of powers are three branches. Words that you need to remember for checks and balances: checks, veto, impeach, unconstitutional. So what is the word up here that you need to remember about one of these various principles of government? So we've got checks and balances, federalism, separation of powers, and due process. So right off the bat, since we're talking about principles, that means we can eliminate due process. That's not going to be your answer. Separation of powers. These powers are reserved to the states. One more time, is that really separating the powers of the national government? No, because we're talking about the states. So it's not going to be separation of powers. Federalism. Is it federalism? Well, does federalism talk about the states? Yes, so maybe it's federalism. Checks and balances. Once again, checks and balances just talk about the national government. So that means checks and balances is not going to be your answer here, because everything when it comes to checks and balances and the separation of powers is about the national government. So the correct answer here is going to be G, federalism, because federalism talks about sharing power with the states. So in this case, because we've got states up here, that means that we're going to be looking for federalism. And this is why we do our key concepts. So in that case, let's go ahead and move on to the next one. Which democratic principle of the Constitution gives the power to the people to create, alter, or abolish government? Once again, your key concept there, people and power. I'm going to leave it up to you guys to find out what the answer is. But that wraps up lesson 837A. Thank you all very much. I appreciate you, and I look forward to seeing you when we get to lesson 837B. Take care.